campus of Jamestown College. This is Knightwatch.
Good evening and welcome to Knightwatch, the JCTV Channel 16 Public Affairs program. I'm Matthew Nies. Well, we're not even through February. 2011 is starting off with a bang, literally, as thousands upon thousands of demonstrators have taken to the streets protesting their governments throughout the Middle East. What's at the root of this revolutionary fervor? For years, many states throughout the region have had authoritarian regimes, with some so-called elected presidents holding office for more than 30 years. The worldwide economic meltdown of 3 years ago hit many of these countries hard, leaving their people faced with massive inflation and an inability to enjoy basic living standards such as housing and food. In many of the nations undergoing revolt, the cry for some form of democratic reform is foremost. Less than 3 weeks ago, longtime Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak resigned his office and fled after 18 straight days of protests and loss of critical support from the army. And it hasn't ended there. Last week, the major U.S. ally in the region and home to the Navy's 5th Fleet, Bahrain, exploded when peaceful protesters were attacked by the army and police. In Libya, strongman Muammar Gaddafi cracked down hard, with hundreds dead after police and military forces opened fire on several funeral corteges. On tonight's program, we'll take a look at some of the root causes behind the rebellions and what might happen in the future. But first, we have two reports. Correspondent Courtney Oliver reports on the strife throughout the region, as well as talks to several people who are in a unique position to lend their expertise in analyzing what's happening.
It began in Tunisia, the North African country of 10 million people, in December 2010. High unemployment, inflated food prices, and poor living conditions brought tens of thousands of ordinary Tunisians to the streets demanding change. 28 days later, the first of the Arab world dictators to fall fled the country on January 14th of this year. 10 days later, the protests spread to Egypt. Beginning in Cairo's Tahrir Square, protesters at first were attacked by police and the army. Longtime supporters of President Hosni Mubarak. By January 29th, it was clear that the regime could no longer control the people. For the first time in his 30-year rule, Mubarak appointed a vice president, Omar Suleiman, and announced he was ceding some of his authority to the vice president. But it wasn't enough. The demonstrators continued to occupy parts of the capital city, and on February 11th, Mubarak resigned the presidency and fled.
My fellow citizens, at these hard circumstances our country is experiencing, President Mohammed Hosni Mubarak has decided to waive the office of the President of the Republic and instructed the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces to run the affairs of the country.
Around the same time, Jordan's King Abdullah named a new prime minister in an effort to stop the flow of unrest, and Yemen saw its leader, President Ali Abdullah Saleh, announced he wouldn't seek another term after 35 years in office. In the meantime, the success of the protests in Tunisia and Egypt emboldened other Arab peoples in the Middle East. Unrest spread throughout the region. Colonel Muammar Gaddafi of Libya ordered security forces to shoot protesters early this week. In Bahrain, large numbers of people were killed or wounded after police suddenly opened fire on protesters gathered in a peaceful demonstration in that Gulf state, home to the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet. Iraq, a country which most Americans are familiar with after nearly 8 years of war, some major protests break out, with military forces opening fire on demonstrators there. A significant number of people involved in the protests in the region made use of social media websites like Facebook and Twitter, and other new media, to spread their messages. Steve Listopad is a professor of journalism and mass communication at Jamestown College, and he thinks the new media has been a major player in the events unfolding throughout the region.
We are seeing mobilizations of large groups of people through new media channels. Channels like Twitter, Facebook, and blog posts, and all sorts of other media avenues.
We have all seen the images on YouTube and pictures posted to Facebook of the protests going on in the Middle East. Do you think the media has twisted some of the facts and taken these pictures and video out of context?
I think that the media always tries to utilize the most exciting and interesting imagery, quotes. It's just part of its nature. So it's unlikely that the media is actively twisting the facts or the taking things out of context. If that's happening, it's more than likely people that's strategists on either side of the parties that are providing the most exciting and interesting imagery and quotes and information out of context to the media to spin stuff in their favor.
Most of the unrest actually started with a Facebook page. What if we didn't have social networking sites such as Facebook and Twitter? How would they have gotten the news out to so many people so quickly?
Revolutions and underground information has always found a way to reach its intended targets, whether through underground newspapers or leaflets or flyers or word of mouth.
Dr. Irene Pash is professor of communication at Jamestown College, and she believes that there are wider implications of the uprisings in the Middle East.
This new Arab voice throws out the gauntlet to the youth of America. As a professor of cross-cultural communication and diversity, I dare my students to take that challenge.
Dr. Pash has served twice overseas in the Peace Corps, an experience she says helps her to understand what the people are seeking.
The American Peace Corps is a concrete voice of that hope, dialogue of people to people, down in the trenches, working together. I know I have been in those trenches. I have experienced that voice of hope in Kenya, Africa, and my own son in Kyrgyzstan.
In recent news from Yemen, there's a young woman who is determined to produce a nonviolent Egyptian-style revolt. Young people in Yemen have the same frustrations with their government as in Egypt. This young woman is hoping to shatter the perceptions of women in their country. Is this a normal act of a woman in the Middle East?
We have heard the voice of the young 32-year-old woman in Yemen speaking out for women's rights. I do think that this is a new radical voice. We remember in the context of our own history that it was only in 1920 that women in America received the right to vote, and still working on, rights for a marginalized group. I certainly think that this will stir up, a whole cadre of new voices in the Middle East.
For more on the situation in Egypt, we turn to our JCTV Channel 16 special correspondent, who prefers to be known only as Sarah, in Cairo, Egypt.
Thanks, Courtney. Well, I guess the way people feel about the fall of Mubarak and the assertion of the army is similar to how the mood is in Cairo right now. But one note that's really encouraged people is that the army said that they wanted the government to continue to run the country. The army didn't take control, and they also said that they would not be nominating anybody from the military to run for presidency, but that it would be a civilian. So I think that also has added to the optimism here. The protests were mostly peaceful. They started off as peaceful, but when the police violence began, I think that's when things got violent. Then they returned to being peaceful until again the faction that were known as the pro-Mubarak people entered the scene and also started attacking some of the protesters there. But apart from that, I would say that over the 18 days they were actually mostly peaceful, but with all revolutions there was obviously some violence. People are really taking ownership of the city and taking the time to clean up the streets and even repaint the sidewalk. And there's a lot of more smaller demonstrations going on where people are starting to ask for higher wages or more rights as working people. And so you see that mood in Cairo, but you also find a lot of people who are pessimistic because the future is really uncertain and we don't really know who's going to nominate themselves for presidency or anything like that yet. So you have both sides of that. From JCTV Channel 16 News, this is Sarah in Cairo. Back to you, Courtney.
For now, the protests go on, growing larger and larger, and unfortunately, bloodier and bloodier. The world is watching. This is Courtney Oliver, JCTV Channel 16 News in Jamestown.
When we come back, I'll be joined by our program's executive producer, Dana Creasy, as we discuss the issue with 5 professors from Jamestown College: Dr. Mort Sarabakhsh, Dr. Tom Johnson, Dr. Steve Reed, Dr. Fadi Fawaz, and Dr. Brian Lang, all here on our Sunday program. Welcome back to our program. If you're just joining us, I'd like to welcome you to Knightwatch. And I'd also like to welcome our executive producer, Dana Creasy of the Communication Department here at Jamestown College, who is sitting in for our special analyst from the Jamestown Sun, Keith Norman, who is off today. Dana, thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here.
And we look forward to your insight. Thank you very much also to our other guests, and we'd like to welcome you. Dr. Mort Sarabakhsh is a native of Iran and teaches in the business department. Welcome, Dr. Sarabakhsh.
Thank you.
Dr. Thomas Johnson is a political scientist specializing in international affairs. Welcome, Dr. Johnson.
Good to see you, Matthew.
And Dr. Stephen Reed, who has been a close observer of Israel from his time there studying the Dead Sea Scrolls and teaches in the Religion and Philosophy department. Thank you very much for joining us, gentlemen. As we talked about in the opening and also saw in the reports, the Middle East seems to be exploding as of late. Governments are being toppled, others are in grave danger of joining them. Armies who were longtime supporters of oppressive regimes suddenly are changing sides. But what brought all this on? Political scientist Dr. Johnson, why don't we just address that straight out?
Well, given that it's a political issue, there's no single answer, nor is there a simple answer. There's a lot of factors that have come together, really, to bring all of this to a head, one of those perfect storm situations. You have a combination of traditionally repressive regimes, whether in a subtle or in a very overt way. Add to that technological changes with the flow of information, particularly across the internet, but other means as well. And some less interesting, more mundane flashpoint issues, including things like food inflation, prices going up and leading to food riots in certain places and a lot of discontent. I don't think there's a single way to say that this is why this happened without getting into extremely detailed explanations. And if we go with something too simple, we're really losing a lot of the subtlety of what has happened in many ways.
Do you think that there's a lot of influence from what started in Tunisia, of course, in late December and then moved forward? Do you think that that's influencing? We're hearing stories right now of young people being responsible for the vast majority of these protests.
Well, I think it would be remiss to say that Tunisia did not really start the snowball effect going on here. That what happened in Tunisia really flowed over into other places, and with Egypt, it's gone to many other countries as well. Not so much a cause as it is the thing which ignites the tinderbox.
Now, Dr. Sarabakhsh, you lived in Iran before coming to this country.
Yeah.
Can you speculate what might be going through the minds of this new crop of revolutionaries?
Well, I just want to add to some of the points that Dr. Johnson said. I guess this upheaval or this movement that is happening in the Middle East, it is called the youth movement. If we looked around in the Middle East, you have got over 60% of the population that are under 30 years old. And at the same time, this generation is highly technical in a sense that I call them computer educated, that they are able to communicate with each other with textings, reading of the websites, internet, and also watching the cable news and having global perspective. So you have got two components here. You have got a very young generations in the Middle East. At the same time, you have got these young generations that is called youth movement. They'd like to be empowered. And in my judgment is that this generations, they have born in most of these countries that the leaders have never changed, such as Libya, such as South Yemen, or in Saudi Arabia, or even in Bahrain. You can see this movement really is a natural evolution of democracy that this generation likes to find job. I think one of the other points I'd like to add to what Dr. Johnson said is that unemployment among these young people are seriously high. And the majority of people are living in poverty. But the governments that they are in charge, they're all very, very wealthy. So this is the old cliche of have and have not are opposing each other. And the young people eventually, in my judgment, are going to win because they like to see a fundamental change. They like to be empowered. They want to see something happens that their voice to be heard in the direction of the government.
There's been a lot of unrest recently again in Iran.
Yes.
And of course, each time the regime usually cracks down. But there's been a significant amount of discussion lately, and perhaps you can speak to this too, that there really is some democracy in Iran, that people can vote and that there's people elected to office. Is it really a democracy?
Well, it's not. The European democracy, Western democracy cannot be 100% implemented in the Middle East and the rest of the world. Jeffersonian democracy. I think in my judgment, democracy is a process that it takes time. Even in the United States, we had over 200 years to really evolve the democracy that we cherish it today. Even the European, after the Dark Ages, took him 600 years to understand democracy. Democracy is a journey that you have to go through many, many years to really learn that. In Iran, I think Iranians, they are voting, but doesn't mean that they can vote to anyone they like to do that. But, there's a processes going on at least there. I mean, there is a Congress, there's a cabinet. So to some degree, there are some, I would say, practices of I would say democracy is being handled. But again, we should always be very careful when we talk about democracy, that we shouldn't look at the Western democracy and we want to see it exactly to be replicated in the other part of the world. Because democracy has to be formed within a cultural context of the societies and the people that live in that part of the world.
I would second what Dr. Sarabakhsh is saying, in that the word democracy is bandied about in the media with tremendous carelessness, what exactly it constitutes. If we consider what it has evolved into in the United States and what's considered the liberal democratic model, the small L liberal democratic model, includes a lot more things than just elections. There are a lot of countries around the world, a majority of countries around the world that have elections, and in many cases those elections are meaningless in any grand political sense. But broader questions, and here we're talking as well about countries like Russia, but where there is no freedom of the press, where there is very little freedom of political expression, and particularly freedom of political organization, that you don't really have democracy. You have the veneer, you have an institution, you have something you can call a parliament. But those tools don't democracy make. There's a lot more to it that's involved, and this is just scratching the surface. So, seconding what he was saying, really we use the term a little bit carelessly.
Although you mentioned that Tunisia recently has been starting this, one could say that the Palestinians were the first group of people that were really fighting for freedom from Israel. And in a sense, they learned democracy from Israel as well. Israel is one of the few democracies in the region, so it could be argued it's a different situation, obviously, with the Palestinians, but wanting to have freedom, wanting to have rights, and a movement that's happened for a long time. Arafat's been around, well, he's no longer with us, but the Palestinian Liberation Organization for roughly 50 years has been involved in this fight for freedom. It seems to me that's one of the earlier movements and perhaps a trendsetter in this area of the world too. It's been going on a long time.
I just want to add one more point again to our audience, that we shouldn't be rushing to see democracy. Democracy is like a little seed, you have to let it grow. Look at in the United States, again, I want to remind all of us that over 200 years we have gone through slavery, recognition of Native American rights. We had civil war in this country. over the years we have been able to evolve and create the democracy that we have today. So you can't really introduce democracy over 1 year or 2 years. Generation has to come and go, and within their own value system, they have to really do that. Again, still today, Americans, like other societies, are trying to work out their democracy. We have Supreme Court, we change laws and regulations, so we have to be patient that these countries need time to really grow democracy within their own culture.
Now, in reviewing the events in the Middle East, especially this past week, when the new military junta in Egypt granted permission to Iran's navy to transit through the Suez Canal, something not done since the '79 revolution, Israel is obviously getting pretty nervous about this. The Prime Minister called the Suez Passage an area of grave concern. Now, Dr. Reed, you spent some considerable time in Israel. You know what they think like and how they view things. How do you think Israelis are viewing the events that are unfolding?
Well, from what we've been hearing, obviously they're very nervous, they're very concerned about what's happening. Many of the Arab countries have never acknowledged even the legitimacy of Israel as a nation. They had a friend in Egypt before, and their peace treaty had been maintained. So if you're surrounded by enemies, they have good reason to be very concerned. Israel is a tiny little country. From Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, it's 2 or 3 hours by car. It's longer, but it's a narrow, tiny little country. And if you've got enemies surrounding you on all sides, there's not much security. So they're going to be very nervous about what happens. For good reason.
There's been some discussion that the two-state solution, as it were, between for the Palestinian question, between Israel and Egypt, that's been assisting on one side, Jordan on the other, may be in fact dead. What do you think? I mean, do we think that peace process may be gone?
I think with the volatile situation that is going on in the Middle East right now, and Dr. Reed and I have talked about this during the lunch break and during the kind of a casual conversation. I think for the Israelis it would be much better to make a more proactive movement in peace treaty. I was just reading some articles, and that I think there is a consensus about the Arab countries. As you know, Iran is not an Arab country. It's a Muslim country, but it's not an Arab country, and it's a Shia Muslim country. Is that there is a consensus about all of the neighbors that if Israel goes back to the border of 1967, of what it was, with the East Jerusalem to be given to Palestine, I think there is a great possibility that there will be a serious negotiation about peace treatment. In 2002, I think Saudis, they had a convention and meetings in Beirut, Lebanon. And I think all of them indicated the fact that if Israel initiates to 1967, there is a great likelihood those countries will recognize. So with the volatile situation today, I guess the more Israelis do not get engaged in peace process, in my judgment, I think it will have a tougher time, because you don't know what these governments end up to be. None of us, we don't know what's going to happen to Egypt 6 months from now. We don't know what's going to happen in Libya. So you might have some radical governments. But I think if the Israeli governments look at it seriously, I think they need to look at as faster as they can to move forward.
I think it's very difficult. It's a very tiny place. In some ways, whether it's economically feasible to have two states in such a narrow little area is a problem. You have enough people on both sides. Palestinians want all of it rather than part of it, and there are enough Israelis that want all of it and not part of it. That you have a parliamentary system. It's difficult to get the government to get a majority that will agree to a peace process. There's been settlement in the West Bank, and the government has continued to do that. So there are lots of Israelis living in the West Bank. There are major economic issues with water rights and water problems, that are controlled above the Sea of Galilee, that is used for irrigation. Some goes to Jordan, some goes to Israel. Some of it's in the West Bank, whether Israel can really feasibly survive without that water supply. So in some ways one wonders if both sides are just playing a game with the peace process, and whether they're either side is very serious. They're trying to wait one another out. So it's hard to know at times. So it's easy to be skeptical about the process.
Some of us don't necessarily wonder whether there are major players on both sides who are in fact just playing that game. That there are players within the contest. It's not one against one, but there's a lot of players on either side. And there are those, some of them who have a lot of influence, who are all or nothing in their perspective. We do get away from the topic of today's show when we go to the Israeli peace process. But
well, this is all very interesting, and we'd definitely like to explore it some more. Dr. Sarabakhsh, Dr. Reed, thank you guys for joining us today and coming in to discuss with us. We'll be back with more from our guest experts after these words.